Hi, Year 10. Welcome to this week's episode of your English Literature podcast. With you today, you have Miss Beaumont,
Mrs. Abdul Kareem, and Miss Hadley.
And today we're talking to you about the poem Porphyria's Lover by Robert Browning. Before you listen to this podcast, it's really important that you've read through the poem yourself. So if you need to, pause it now and take a moment just to read through the poem to get your first impressions of it. But otherwise, we'll get started. So today we're going to start by talking a little bit about the context of the poem, about the poet himself, Robert Browning, and about some of his views and attitudes that might have perhaps influenced him when he was writing the poem. So what do we know about Robert Browning?
So one of the things that we do know about him was that he supported the emancipation of women, and he was really quite concerned about the lack of power that women showed in society. And this is an idea that comes through in his poem. And I think it's quite evident as we go through the poem how that's connected.
So could we describe Robert Browning as a bit of a feminist then, as someone who at least supported early women's rights and the movement towards that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so that's certainly something that we can think about, because as you've read through the poem, I'm sure you've seen that the woman in the poem is not a powerful woman. So that's certainly something that we might want to consider, is perhaps Robert Browning's attitudes towards power and towards women. The other thing I think is quite important to mention is some of the conventions that we see in this poem of the Gothic, which you'll have learned about earlier in school in English literature and language. The Gothic was an incredibly popular form of literature at the time, and it featured damsels in distress, so women who were powerless. It featured very dark settings with often very strong imbalances of power, supernatural elements as well. Things like pathetic fallacies, the weather playing a big role in the violence and destruction that happens within the story. And we can see a lot of these elements of the Gothic playing in Robert Browning's poem here as well. So thinking about some of those Gothic conventions and trying to make links to those would be helpful to think about as well. So shall we look a little bit deeper at the language in the poem and some of the things that perhaps stand out to us? Is there anything that anybody would like to comment on in terms of language or perhaps word choices that they've noticed as they've read?
I think just building up on what you said, Miss Beaumont, about pathetic fallacy, the very first line starts with the rain, and that sets obviously a very gloomy, dark atmosphere, which then is mirrored in the events that follow on in the poem itself. That idea of the rain is actually continued. We see it both in line 1 and then further down the poem in line 30. So it's a continued dark mood all the way through. It's not something that's started negatively and then ends positively. So I'm touching a little bit on structure here, but the fact that it's continued all the way through the poem is quite important as well.
It kind of foreshadows already that something bad's going to happen, because you already know. But as you said, it's a dark atmosphere from the beginning, so it doesn't change. It doesn't get like happy in any point, so you know something bad's gonna end. It's not gonna end well.
The one time you do see very sort of more positive words and images, though, is when Porphyria enters, because it says on line 8 that she shuts the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless great. So actually, she's almost the only light, bright thing in this poem, which I think is something we can see when he describes her hair as well. He uses the word yellow, not gold or blonde or a typical word that we'd use to describe hair, but
like
yellow.
The sun.
Yeah,
sun
it's
shining.
like a really happy, positive, optimistic colour.
Could you link that back to Robert Browning, where you mentioned earlier that he supported the emancipation of women? So the fact that she walks in and she's like a ray of sunshine, she blots all the darkness out. So it's like he's supporting them in that sense as well, like he's lifted her up.
Yeah, I think you could. And it obviously makes the events at the end of the poem seem even more tragic and even more destructive, that she's been presented as such a positive figure, and then she's cruelly and mercilessly murdered at the end of the poem, seemingly with no remorse whatsoever, although I suppose that's debatable. So in terms of the language that's been used here, I think it's really interesting that not just do we see this description of her as having this yellow hair, but there's almost a kind of sexual overtone to that in the way that he describes that. He describes how she lets the damp hair fall. And we've got to remember, in the time that this poem was written, it would have been considered very modest to keep your hair covered, to certainly keep it back and out of your hair. And actually to let the hair fall is a sign of almost a loose woman, a woman who doesn't care about society's morals and standards. So even though she's been presented with this very positive imagery, she also seems to be quite empowered sexually as well.
In slight contrast to that, actually, on line 40, he uses the adjective little when he's describing her throat, which makes her sound almost very innocent and naive and vulnerable. So whilst she is powerful in some regards, he's also highlighting how she is lacking power in that situation. In the dynamic between the two of them, he says 3 times her little throat, in one long yellow string, I wound 3 times her little throat around. So the reference to the little, I thought, was quite important there. Just a point there.
I think there's lots of contradictions in this poem, because obviously I think one of the most significant things that we can say about the structure and the form of this poem is because it's written in the form of a dramatic monologue, and it's the imagined perspective of this of the speaker, of the man. We only actually get his point of view throughout the entire poem, and that means that as our interpretation of what happens as a reader is actually quite unreliable, because we only know the story as he tells it. He's an unreliable narrator potentially. He could be telling us this story, and what actually happened is completely different, but as a reader we wouldn't know. So I think that's a really interesting technique that Robert Browning uses, because it leaves lots of questions about this man's state of mind.
So he's allowed us to come to our own conclusion as to what's actually happening. Okay.
Has he he describes how he murders her. I think he seems quite remorseless about that. There's a reference to God at the end of the poem. God hasn't said a word. Is he perhaps listening out for God? Is he insane? Does he think he can speak to God? Does he think he can hear God's voice? Or is he making a comment about his overall power and how not even gods can step in and take charge or control over his power over this woman?
And I think that links quite nicely, actually, where halfway through the poem he says Porphyria worshipped me, this sense of ego, and how he feels almost like in a godlike state. And that's perhaps why he feels like God isn't saying anything to him, because he feels so powerful over her that no God has the audacity or power to say anything to him at all.
So that's interesting you say that, because that word ego we associate with Freud, and it's not something I'd thought about before, but actually thinking about Freud's belief that the id is a very instinctual part of humans that's within all of us. It's like the speaker here is completely controlled by his id. There is no superego there. There's no moral backbone which is governing his actions. He almost kills because he wants to and sees no...
And he can.
Yeah, sees no reason why not to.
Yeah.
Which I think, sorry, just to jump in, he says, just before he says that she worshipped him, he says he knew. So the confidence, the tone comes through there. There's no doubt within himself of where he places himself in relation to her, in that godlike state that we talked about.
In relation to what you just said there, where you mentioned the 3 times her little throat around, and then it says, and strangled her, full stop, that short sentence is like, it's sure, it's sharp. There's no question, he's not questioning himself, you can't question him. Then he says, no pain felt she. I'm quite sure she felt no pain. So again, it's like that godlike state, I know she didn't feel anything, even though, well, how could you know that? But he's certain of it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just sort of looking at the punctuation there, because you mentioned there's no questions, and there's no questioning throughout the entire poem, but it does seem to get more manic, because we can see at the end of the poem we've got these exclamations. So the use of the exclamation mark, it's love I'm gained instead, and yet God has not said a word on the final line as well. So we can see that he's in this manic state. Perhaps that's because he's taking so much pleasure from what he's done, or perhaps that's a sign of his insanity, or something else. We're not sure, but we can definitely see that this has been an unrelenting onslaught almost that he is unleashed upon Porphyria.
Also, what you mentioned before, like his state of mind would be unstable. There's a lot of repetition, especially of the word "and" from the beginning. So he's got "and laid her sword gloves," "and last she sat down," "and called me," and it's literally just line after line. It's just very repetitive. And as you said before, he talks about her yellow hair a lot as well.
And the fact that it is one long continuous stanza as well almost forces the reader to be swept along in the action of the poem. And we do have a rhyme scheme, but it's, even though it's regular in that it is the same rhyme scheme throughout the poem, the actual rhyme itself is quite unbalanced. So if we look at the first 5 lines of the poem, we've got the first and third line that rhyme. We've got "tonight in spite," and then we've got the second, fourth, but also the fifth as well. So "awake, lake and break." So actually, as you're reading the poem, there's this sense that the poem itself is unbalanced and unhinged, perhaps like he is as well. So there's lots of obviously themes that we can see in this poem in terms of power and desire and sexuality. And for me, the first poem that I thought of in terms of linking to the other poems in the anthology was Sonnet 29, because even though the power and sexuality there isn't as destructive as the power and sexuality in this poem, and as violent, there is still that unbridled, raw, almost animalistic sense behind it. One of the interesting differences is that obviously one is written from the perspective of a man and one is written from the perspective of a woman. So it's quite interesting to see how the power dynamic differs there.
I think also one of the interesting differences is Porphyria's Lover as a poem is very long, whereas Sonnet 29 is quite short, and perhaps that exemplifies how male power has been continuous and relentless and ongoing, whereas where in a situation where women have power, it's short-lived. That's one interpretation, I think. And the other poem that we thought was quite relevant, or was a good comparison to, was The Farmer's Bride, where he essentially controls the way in which she conducts herself as a husband.
Yeah, I mean, The Farmer's Bride is absolutely a poem about the possessiveness of men, and that sense of possession is clearly seen in Porphyria's Lover as well. We can see it through the use of personal pronouns. He said she was mine fair. The fact that he feels a sense of ownership over her. And in The Farmer's Bride, it could be argued that she has slightly more freedom, and she has slightly more power over the farmer at the end of the poem, but really the constraints of the society at the time still means that she is forced to live in his house. And of course, Porphyria here is portrayed as almost entirely powerless as well. So there's some strong contextual links that we could make there between the poems.
I think both poems also make references to hair, which I think is quite interesting. And both are obviously dramatic monologues as well, so that's a good point of comparison.
Okay, so hopefully that's been helpful for you, Year 10. Make sure you tune in next time for the next episode of the podcast. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. Bye.
Bye.